Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this blustery winter day?
Well, I'm okay, other than I got a little bit of a dry, scratchy throat. I'll apologize to all the listeners up front if I have to cough. And it is windy and blustery here as well. We've had every kind of weather under the sun in the last 24 hours. We've had snow, sleet, freezing rain, regular rain, sun, and now a wind.
Yeah, interesting. Now, like an idiot, Mrs. Stu and I, it's very rare when she gets a Saturday off from her job. So we like to go to flea markets, and there was one in just right near Punxsutawney that we wanted to go to. So we said, we're going to go. So yesterday morning, it started out, there was just some light, fluffy flurries. And I'm thinking, no trouble whatsoever. By the time we left, it was a full blown snowstorm. The roads were untreated for the most part, and it was horrendous. It took us nearly 2 hours to get there. And we figured that and the place we were going through was huge. So we said, we'll take a long time going through, which we did. We were there several hours just to basically brush over everything too. So we're probably going to go back anyway. So yeah, I can say for absolutely certain that we've had all kinds of weather. So if you are returning to us, oh, I see a kitty coming in and out of focus there. If you are returning, we thank you for coming back. We're sorry we took off a couple of weeks. We had a couple of exigent circumstances where we couldn't record, but now we're back. If you have not subscribed previously, please click the like. Please subscribe and the bell to get notified when we release new content. Otherwise, the description will have everything else Paranormalist podcast related, including our Facebook groups and email address. And I think with that, here's where I routinely say, what's our topic for today?
So poltergeists are our topic for the day. And I wanted to very quickly explain that nobody really knows what a poltergeist activity is. So the traditional theory was that it was a haunting. Some people believe it's a demonic infestation. Some people believe, and we're going to talk about a case where this theory came into play, that it was actually fracturing of a person's psyche, and that this releases energy that creates this activity. So I thought I'd run through the 7 signs of poltergeist activity so people know what makes a poltergeist a poltergeist. The first sign would be disappearing objects. So you lay something down and it's gone. The other is, the next sign is levitation or thrown objects. So with levitation and thrown objects, that means things obviously coming up off the table or whatever, thrown often from nowhere. Like literally, you can't explain where the object came from. So it drops out of the ceiling, it flies through and smashes a window. There are some stories where they materialize in the middle of the air and they watch it drop or swing, or it goes against gravity and comes up off the ground as though something shoved it up out. Very interesting.
A lot of things you were describing there, I mean, were in the movie Poltergeist, with William Hurt and JoBeth Williams.
And to be honest with you, there is an actual story that came from. There's a case that was the genesis for that. So the third one is scents and odors. It can be cigarette smell, fruit, food. So you can also smell rotting meat smell, just, really nasty smells, sulfur smells, things like that, or perfumes. It can be anything. Electrical interference. So somebody looks at their clock and it's 3 a.m. But when they look at the, at their telephone, or if they look at another clock, or they listen to the radio's like, it is 5 a.m. And they're like, I don't understand. Or TVs will start to glitch out. Computers will glitch out. Anything like that. That could be it. And then power from nowhere is a really interesting one. And by that, I mean, things start working on their own. For example, the clock that sits in this hallway has not run for the last 300 years, says the tour guide. And then as they walk away, it starts booming. Boom, boom, boom. And then the tour guide looks at you and goes, no, that can't happen. The mechanism's missing internally. Things starting on their own. There was a poltergeist case I did many years ago where they had one of those stuffed toys. And I've seen two places where this has happened in my lifetime personally, where there was one of those great big stuffed toys you get for small children. One was a Barney doll, and it was a big plushy one. And the other was a Sesame Street character. And in both instances, the toy came on its own. And in both cases, um, it had no mechanism to make it do this because the thing had been cut out. Every parent on the planet thinks they're really cute when they're in the store and they go, "Aw, Junior's gonna love it." After you've heard for the 437th time in 2 hours, "My name is Elmo," you really want to kill Elmo. Okay, that's just all there is to it. So people take the batteries out. But in these two particular instances, that didn't suffice. So they literally, the father cut the little packet that holds the batteries in out of the device. So there was no question it couldn't work, and it still worked. And interestingly enough, in one of the two cases, the thing was saying stuff that it wasn't programmed to say. So like I went to the store and I looked for this thing. It was a brand new toy. It had only been there about 6 months. And I went to the store and I matched it up with another brand new version. And on the side of the panel of the box, it tells you everything it's going to say. "Hello, my name is Big Bird. Would you like to play with me?" You know, stuff like that. And it would say things that it wasn't on the box. It wasn't programmed to say. So that would be something.
What's it in the correct voice?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, honestly, it just sounded just like that regular toy, but there's no mechanism to make that happen. And even if there were a mechanism to make that happen, it's saying things that the company says it's not programmed to say. Nothing. It was never anything awful, evil, or whatever. But when you have a toy and it turns its head and it's not supposed to move, they're not animated, and it goes, "What is your name?" And you're like, "That's not on the box. Nope, not on the box." It's very disconcerting. And it can be something like, as simple as like a train sitting under a Christmas tree and it isn't able to run because it's not connected appropriately for that. It's just for show. And then all of a sudden in the middle of the night, it starts taking off on its own and doing its thing. That's kind of creepy. Another thing that you can expect in such of a poltergeist haunting or poltergeist activity, knocking, rapping, footsteps, and noises. So a group of people milling in a room, voices. Obviously, knocks and rappings are what they are. Footsteps, walking, disembodied, marching, sounds of music, all kinds of things. And then physical attacks, which can be from, being pushed or shoved to literally, there are some stories out there, the Bell Witch story being the one that comes rapidly to mind, where things have happened to physically incapacitate different members of the family, and one was beaten badly multiple times throughout the event. It was the daughter of Mr. Bell, and according to all the versions of the story of the Bell Witch, Mr. Bell was poisoned to death by the Bell Witch, and she gleefully chortled and cried out after he died, as he died, that she had finally killed him. And it was heard, a disembodied voice was heard. And so those are kind of the features that make a poltergeist haunting. And believe it or not, although we don't talk a lot about them, there are a lot of them out there that exist, and it is just insane. So our first one we're going to talk about is about a woman named Joan Reish, and this took place in 1984. And Joan was really worried about her daughter Tina. The girl was 14 years old, and she was really having problems. They began to she was struggling with being a teenager. She was struggling with fitting in school, all that angst and stuff that happens in those early teen years for a lot of kids, particularly girls. Girls are literally, I think, a lot more cliquish, clannish. They want to fit in even more than the guys. Not saying guys don't need it too, but it's like a rite of passage. And if you don't fit into the right cliques as a teenage girl, life can be literally hell, because they're like a bunch of chickens in a barnyard. They'll peck the shit out of you till they kill you. And I don't mean, and I'm not even exaggerating slightly. Anybody who's ever grown up in a school system has watched. There's always been that couple girls that were sort of on the outskirts and they were treated like crap all the time. So it's a thing. So it's a big deal. And anyway, so as her teenage angst is going on and she's struggling with fitting into her high school years, things start to happen at home. First thing are objects begin to fly. She's sitting and there's a piece of ceramics, on the stand beside her, a knick-knack of some sort, and it just spontaneously flies off the table, smashes into the wall. Her mother screams, "Why did you throw that?" She's like, "I didn't throw that." And this went on for quite a while until it happened in front of mom, and mom actually saw it propelling itself off of the stand or table. And at that point, mom finally believes that she's not physically causing this. And probably the moment where that happened is whenever she was sitting there yelling at her daughter about having broken something else. And at that moment in time, her daughter's hands are literally up in the air, like, "I didn't do it." And at that moment, beside her, the telephone, the great big old bulky telephones of the 80s, came flying off the stand and flung itself at her mother in front of her mother looking at it. And that was when her mother finally began to believe that something was really wrong. So after that, there's just a barrage of these things, some of them potentially lethal, knives and forks and stuff like that, that are being thrown, and they don't know what to do. Like, you go to the doctor, you talk to the doctor says you're crazy. I'll give her some sedatives. I'll give you a little something too, because obviously you're a little wonky yourself. And they send you home. So then you try, if you even go this far, you'll go to the psych doctor and they're like, "Okay, so you're both having delusions. We got a pill for that." And it doesn't change it. In fact, in some stories I've read, it actually increases it. I think because the inhibiting factor of the person trying to not do it is thwarted by the medication. Because, you're not yourself and you're a little drowsy and you're not really as focused as you should be and what have you. But anyway, so they go through all of this. And then the story goes that the family decided to reach out. They had read a reporter by the name of Mike Harden, excuse me. And Mike had written a profile on Joan and her husband a few years earlier. They were known in the community. They had adopted children through foster children. And Tina was one of the kids that they had brought into their home over the years. So they knew a lot about foster care and about what children are like when they're struggling, teenagers and what have you. Because according to the documents, over the course of their career, over about 30 years, they took in almost 100 children. A few they were just fostering for a while, and then later there were others that they adopted and kept. So they definitely knew what kids were like. They'd never encountered this. So with all of this going on, Tina being the way she was, Joan, out of desperation, calls him and says, "Have you ever heard of any such thing? I don't know what to do. I'm scared to death." So he comes over and he kind of talks to the family and gets introduced to Tina. And on that initial visit, there was a lamp that was sitting on a stand, and it propelled itself off the table beside him towards Tina in the doorway, who's standing there saying, "Hi, it's nice to meet you too." Then he picks it up and puts it back on the stand, and it does it again and again until it broke eventually on the fourth time. So then Joan said to him, "Just leave it lay there. It's okay." And he writes this, he starts to write this article, and he goes back to the Columbus Dispatch and he says, "I need a photographer. Whatever's going on here, it's really physical. And I know the kid's not doing it, or at least not doing most of it." So he gets this photographer to come. His name's Fred Shannon. And they go and they sit in the living room and talk to the family for hours and hours. And As they're just about tired, it's giving up for the night and saying, say, hey, it's getting late, we're going to go. Tina's sitting in a big old stuffed chair, and the telephone sitting on the chair beside her rises itself up slowly, suspends itself in the air. And then the receiver, just leading it, as if somebody picked up the receiver and threw the receiver, throws itself at her and smacks her. And at that second, Fred Shannon, the guy that's the photographer, had looked away, but he had his camera in his hands, and he whirled around and he snapped a photograph. Her mouth is open in the picture. She's like leaning back, like trying to avoid getting hit. And there is a photograph. You can look it up if you want. And this is kind of what got them started on the idea of this being a poltergeist. So this begins, he writes this article, he doesn't really know what else to do with it. This continues on. People come and check it out. There's police officers, there's doctors, there's priests, there's different people throughout the whole of this event. Nobody ever explains it, and as fast as it came, as suddenly as it arrived, eventually it goes away as Tina gets a little older. It's a really interesting story. And that's also one of the mechanisms of poltergeist activity that they should have added into that list I gave you. So poltergeist activity usually starts very spontaneously. It's not something that comes in slowly. And it ends often very abruptly, and usually after a few months. So it's not a long-lasting thing. We're going to go to Ireland now, to a place called Derry Gonelli, and it's a farmhouse. And in this particular farmhouse, this couple have their teenage daughter. This story takes place in the end of the 19th century, so it would be the late 1800s. And according to the story, as it was recorded, and most of this was recorded at the time by various people, the priests in town and what have you, who was consulted early on, that in Derry Gonley, there was this little cottage was had a living room and kitchen combination little thing, and two rooms off to the side that were bedrooms that were split up for the family. And of course, they didn't have electricity or any of those things at that time frame, just oil lamps. And they would cook and heat with the wood stove on the one side of the big room. And then, you would go to your bedroom and sleep. Now, there were several kids, so the daughters shared the bedroom, and, the boys shared another bed at the far end of that small room. And that's sort of how it was. So the eldest of the children was a girl by the name of Maggie. And, first there was a couple rumors that something was going on, but really nothing, there was a reputation for the house, but nothing had ever happened there since this family moved in. So the first thing that they notice is amiss is they hear a loud rapping and scratching sounds in the walls at night. Then objects begin to move. Things are found outside the farmhouse at particularly after a night when there's a lot of banging and thumping and rapping. And so that would be like your shoes that were under the edge of your bed when you went to sleep. And people didn't have 10 pairs of shoes. You had a pair of shoes, so you took good care of them. Or if it's in my mother's case, 45 pairs of shoes. My mother was a shoe person. And, so like you took really good care of them, and you only wore them when you needed to and what have you. They were polished and kept, oiled so that they wouldn't get dry rotted and all this. And then you get up in the morning and they're sitting in the bucket for the well or some crazy place where nobody would ever put them. And same with clothing, food items, all kinds of stuff. And lamps, candles, any kind of lighting apparatus started to disappear. And they were always found outside, sitting in the yard, sitting in the little wheelbarrow, sitting in just odd places where nobody would put these items. They weren't broken, they were just outside. So the family was Methodist, and he had talked to the minister, and the minister said, leave your Bible open weighted down the pages with stones, and he gave him a particular passage to have open. And he did. He put the Bible in Mary's bedroom, or excuse me, Maggie and her sister's room, rather. So she and her sister shared this room, and he put it on the nightstand, and he put those little stones on it to hold it open so nobody would flip the pages. And as soon as he laid it down, the stones went flying off of it. And he went outside and he got larger stones and put on it, and they went off of it. And then he went out and he got larger stones, I mean like stones, and he laid them down on it. And that seemed to work for a little bit. And then they went off of it. And then the Bible pages began to rip out on their own. So this story kind of spreads around the whole community and eventually makes its way to a guy by the name of Sir William Barrett. He's a famous parapsychologist who was visiting another gentleman in that area. Now, to give you some background so that it makes sense, how convenient that a famous parapsychologist showed up just whenever this was all about to occur. So there were a lot of what they called psychical societies in the late 1800s. And because the seances and all of that, Ouija boards and stuff were very, very popular. It was in the United States, it was popular because this had been not too long after the end of the Civil War. People wanted to know what happened to family members that had disappeared. They wanted to talk to, like you can imagine a woman who's been grieving for the son who disappeared and she doesn't have a body to bury. And so she goes to the Ouija board with the local psychic lady and says, I need to know what happened to Teddy. Is he okay? And so there was a lot of fraud and graft involved in that, because where there's desperation, there's also nasty people who would take advantage. But anyway, so there were a lot of people into this stuff, and there were a lot of societies and associations and what have you. So believe it or not, there were much more than today. Like today, you could probably only name about a dozen people that are really experts in the field, maybe 2 dozen. But back then, there were a lot of people studying it, writing about it, and a lot of very well-to-do men. They they had already made their fortunes, so they were really interested in something novel, and this was novel. So he makes this Sir William Barrett makes contact with the family after he reads this story in something called the Gazetteer, which is like a little magazine. And he says, this is a quote from the magazine. After the children, except the boy and Maggie, had retired to bed, Maggie lay fully clothed on top of her bed with her arms and legs to be seen at all times. The rest of us settled around the kitchen fire. When faint rapping sounds could be heard, these got louder, apparently coming from in the walls, the ceiling, and other parts of the bedroom to which the door had been left open. And this is a description from the writer and others who had come in. And he says, upon entering the room with a lamp, the noises stopped but commenced again once the lamp had been placed on the windowsill. I kept the boy and his father at my side and asked for them to look outside, meaning other people in the room. Eventually, I was able to approach the bed where I saw the younger children asleep and Maggie motionless, whereas the noises were still as loud as ever. Under close inspection, there was no explanation for the noises or items moving. Suddenly, a pebble landed on the bed beside Maggie, with no matter of explanation. She had not moved either her arms or legs. Barrett would come to visit the farmhouse, and he would spend 3 nights at the place with other members of a spiritualist society. The events he recorded are very much the same. There were other experiments carried out by other members of the society and the Barrett family. They documented all of this, and then they called in Reverend Maxwell Close, who was a friend of Mr. Barrett's, who read passages from his Bible. And he said in his writings, Barrett would write, at first there was a tremendous din. It gradually got fainter until the noises disappeared. By the time he, meaning the Reverend, got to the Lord's Prayer, after that, the haunting had come to a stop. Interesting to me because this is one of the very few of these stories where that's how easily it ended. A lot of times they're very resistant to like Bibles. Like I said, the first part of this, I said they ripped the entity, whatever it was, ripped up the Bibles. So in a lot of times they come into religious households. We're going to talk about about a little girl she was an 18-year-old girl, Esther Cox from Nova Scotia. And excuse me, I apologize. Not from Nova Scotia, Esther Cox from Amherst. I apologize. Up there above it, I had written the word, but it was for something else. And I apologize. My notes aren't as good as I usually keep them. So anyhow, Esther is kind of coming from that same time period, late 19th century. She's 18 years old. This became a really popular thing. Like you heard stories like this all the time. So what happened to Esther is it starts late in the summer of 1878. She's at her home on what's called Princess Street with her family, and there's the obligatory thumping. There's stones falling out of the ceiling, potatoes falling out of the ceiling, things coming through the windows, smashing the windows, things like that. And then in the late summer, there was banging sounds that would come up. There were flames that would shoot up out of nowhere and have to be put out. And one night, scratched above the young woman's bed, were these words: Esther Cox, you are mine to kill. And the family was in the living room when this happened, all of them together seeing each other. And whenever the girls went to bed, they found this above Esther's bed. People came from all over, from like New York and other places, began to do research on it. The hauntings are very well documented. It got to the point where she was being pulled out of bed at night. She was being slapped and bitten and beaten. At one point, it gets so bad, the family sends her to live with other family members far away. During that period, there's no activity at all. And interestingly enough, no activity with Esther. Like when she went to the other place, there was no activity after she left the house. Now, what happened to cause it? Nobody knows. There's lots of supposition. Some people believe it started as a prank and then it got out of hand. It might have even been, if you want to go with the prank theory, you might be able to make a good argument to me that it became a tulpa, that after people began to believe in it, it began to become a self-generating force. I don't know. Eventually Esther would return home. It would kind of mellow out. Then it would pick up again a little bit. This is one of the longer lasting ones. It lasted for nearly a year. And eventually it calmed down a little bit. And particularly after Esther's mom had died, her father sold the house and Esther went to live with her sister and kind of act as that family's maid. And at that point, it ended. It just ended. She never went back to the place and it ended at that point. So fortunately for her, it wasn't something that happened forever because, like I said, and they're mostly not those really, really long periods. Usually it's like 4 or 5 months and it's over. This one lasted for like 18 months in total.
Hmm.
And it might sound like, okay, well, it's no big deal, but when you're living through this, it is so disconcerting to be sitting there peeling potatoes and have stones rain out of the ceiling on your head. At one point, they went to church one Sunday, and when they came back, all of their pillows were twisted into effigies of faces.
My.
And they couldn't explain it. So it messes with you mentally as well as spiritually. We're going to move on and we're going to go to the 1960s to a 19-year-old girl by the name of Anne-Marie Chabrel. Now, she took a job in Rosenheim, Germany. She was a secretary at a law firm. She was really excited about this new job. It was, something to start her life off. The law firm hired her. She was pretty, pleasant, capable of doing what they needed her to do. Basically, receptionist work, filing, stuff like that. It was a starter job, like a lot of people have at the beginning. However, as soon as she starts working within weeks, they start to notice this is a very old building and it has these high, like 12-foot high ceilings with lights that hang down on a chain. And you walk down this long hallway and there's a series of these lights going down the hallway. And the lawyers begin to notice these bizarre things, like when she walks down that hallway, as she gets as she's going through it, and every time she goes under a light, the lights begin to swing or sway. And then as she moves on down, they're all moving. And by the time she gets to the end of the hall, the whole series of like 6 lights is moving. And they were like, that's just crazy. Um, you know, then the lights began to blow up. Like literally the bulbs would explode as she would go down the hallway. At first they thought there was like a power surge. They had it checked out. Didn't seem to be. When she wasn't there, it never happens. And then furniture began to move itself, like in front of them. Not just you came in the next day and the furniture was moved, but like you're literally sitting at your desk and the chair that's over by the window scoots itself over to the desk. That's a pretty disconcerting thing to see. And you can imagine how the lawyers felt, particularly when they had clients in the room. So then this fluid starts to leak from the copier. They finally call in somebody and they check it out. And whatever this fluid is, it's not, it's ink, it's copy fluid, but it's not coming out of the cartridges in the machine. They're completely sealed. There's no leakage spots, no nothing. And they can't explain it. So eventually this activity hits a peak to the point where cabinet drawers open and files start flying out. She'll be standing there doing something and the potted plant on top of the filing cabinet shot itself across the room and smashed against the desk of the other secretary out there. It was a very disconcerting atmosphere. Eventually they kind of run out of other things to do, so they get a hold of a parapsychologist by the name of Hans Benzer, who then films the disturbances. And by the way, the video footage of this is still available if you go online and look up her case, which is Anne-Marie Schaberl, Schaberl, and then Hans, Hans, Bender, Bend. You can actually see the footage of her walking down like that long hallway I described, and those beautiful old lights above her swinging in circles and moving as she goes. And he begins to suspect that what she has is psychokinesis, which is it, and he says it's a manifestation of her deep and mournful sadness. The young woman, when he interviewed her, stated she was depressed. He said, I believe the depression is so profound that it is strong enough to have moved furniture. And this continues to go on for a little while. Eventually, they will ask the young lady to leave the law firm because of all this that's going on. And she leaves and immediately it stops. This is a case called the Baldoon case, Baldoon, from Southern Ontario, and it's a fascinating story. So the story starts with the McDonald family in 1829, and some of the women are preparing straw in the barn when, without warning, the poles of the barn's roof structure begin to fall inward on top of them, and some of them are impaled are hurt. Nobody dies. They can't find any source for what caused it. It was a sound structure. Now there's no broken posts or poles or anything to like show what, how it shifted the weight or what have you. They have no idea. So that's the first thing that seems weird. And they move on. So then next comes the sounds. They would hear the sounds of footsteps throughout the house in the kitchen, and it would be multiple people stomping in the kitchen, almost like soldiers marching, but there was nobody there. It was day and night. It didn't matter. Everybody could be sitting at the table and they would be marching right through the room. Everybody could be in bed, come running downstairs, and it still was always in the kitchen. These were very loud, and the way the family would describe it, it was rhythmic marching like men preparing for war. And this went on for quite a while. And it's a small cabin. I want everybody to know. We're talking maybe 3 rooms. It's a small cabin. It's not large. And then one of the children had something happen. So the baby was sitting in a wooden cradle, like laying in a wooden cradle, just playing. And all of a sudden, it began to rock back and forth violently. 3 men rushed over that were sitting at the table and tried to stop the cradle. But even with 3 men holding this cradle down, the cradle kept going with this unseen set of hands, just pushing it as though they weren't even attempting to stop the cradle. And eventually, the men backed away from it in terror because they couldn't hold on to it. And then fires began to be spotted throughout the property. They would, it was as though somebody was attempting to burn down the homestead. So everybody would be in the kitchen, living area, and all of a sudden they'd smell smoke and they'd run upstairs and there'd be a little pile of straw in the middle of the floor. Everybody in the house was sitting at the table, and it was on fire. Or they would see a piece of bedding on fire. And this went on and on. And as soon as one fire was doused out, the next fire would start. So the family was exhausted because you couldn't even sleep in peace, and then multiple fires in an hour or two. So they couldn't find any ignition source. It was just the most bizarre thing. The most common thing were the rocks and the bullets that were propelled through the glass windows, broke the glass windows of the house. And they would collect the rocks and the bullets, and there would be like unique things carved on them, spirals and different things. And they would take them back out and throw them away. At one point, they were taking the rocks and throwing them in the river. When they get back home, the things would come flying back in. They even took to marking some of the rocks by chipping at them to make like some sort of a mark that they could recognize. And that by the time they came back from throwing them in the river, they'd barely sit down and the rocks would be thrown back into the building. This went on for weeks, and the family, couldn't afford to keep replacing the glass because it would break it every time. They ended up boarding up the windows. So instead of the glass shattering, they would hear this thump of things hitting the wood where the glass had been, and just they go outside and there would be these little piles of rocks and bullets and what have you, and they couldn't explain it. And it was so numerous that they said they collected and redeposited them almost daily. So that's a lot. So eventually the neighbors begin to hear about it, how stuff like that spreads, and they're coming over to check it out. Then the newspapers pick up the story, and it's now the talk of the town, literally. At first, the McDonald's welcomed people, saying, hey, maybe you have an idea. They were neighborly. However, this began to get out of hand, and they couldn't handle things, and they couldn't take care of their property. Now, eventually, they move in with the father, and the stuff happens there. So now they have to try to replace the father's windows, and they end up deciding to go live in a tent outside of their home, which they end up living in this tent for several weeks until everything starts to calm down. At one point, it was like the talk of the area, and a woman came out who was, quote unquote, gifted with the powers of second sight. And they talked to this woman, and she came to visit them, and she said that this was a curse that had been placed on the property by an old woman. And they knew, and somebody said, well, don't you remember you used to have this spat with Mrs. So-and-so, the widow so-and-so? And this was originally when whenever the Sons had purchased this property early in the 1820s, and then they had lost the property due to financial issues. And this family, the McDonald's, purchased the property, and this woman's telling them that because they lost this property to the McDonald's, that this lady put a curse on the property, and that's what caused it. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. Some of the different stories say that they began to do some rituals to rid themselves of the poltergeist, and it suddenly stopped. Um, However, this woman tells them that they need to, this is the story, that they need to get a silver bullet and shoot a black goose with a silver bullet, and that the old woman had used witchcraft on this bird and it was on the property, and the McDonald's killed that bird, then they would see who the woman was, because she would be injured. So it's very much like those old wives' tales where they would cut that, hurt the werewolf, and now you went back to the house and the woman had a big gash on her arm or whatever. It was that kind of stuff. At first, this didn't happen, but as this goes on and on and on, according to the stories, then eventually they actually do find a black goose that's hanging out at the edge of the property at the river and shoot it. And after that, supposedly, the stories of the haunting end. By the mid 1830s, the farm was no longer the destination of the paranormally curious. They lived for 3 years in terror. But then after that, everything went away. Apparently, after they shot the goose. The house would burn down in 1930. So I thought it was an interesting story. Has a couple interesting twists to it, because, it just, you have that story of the goose and all of that, and it just was really interesting. So we're going to end with this last story. This story takes place in 1938. A woman by the name of Alma Fielding, who's 34 years old. She's married, and she has 2 children, and apparently happily married. She lives in a nice neighborhood in Croydon, and which is in England, and she just living a nice life. Eventually, however, something will happen in her life that will propel her into a completely different world. So on February 20th in 1938, a magazine called the Sunday Pictorial carried a report of a haunting in her home, and that this housewife, which was Alma, called them about strange events that were going on with her family. So it was her son. She particularly names her son Dawn, and then a lodger in their home named George Saunders. Among the things she reported happening to the newspaper was that money would come out of nowhere, pennies would pelt the guy who was lodging with them, all kinds of crazy things moving in the house. And she said, "Do you know of anybody who can help us?" Well, the newspaper is interested, so they send 2 reporters out. The reporters knock on the door, and when she opens the door, fully expecting them to be there, an egg comes flying out the hallway and past her over her shoulder. She's standing in front of them, one hand on the door frame, the other hand on the door that she's just opened. And it goes past her and lands on the floor at their feet, just in the doorway entry area, and doesn't break. That was their hello. So as they come in, they pick up the egg, and she's rattled, and she's like, "I'm so sorry. This is the kind of stuff that happens all the time." She's prepared a tea for them, so she offers them tea in the living room, and as she's handing the first little cup and saucer of tea, it was a pink china dog that was sitting on the floor by the fireplace, begins to rattle and jump, and then a sharp bladed tin opener. So that would have been one of those old ones that was like really pointy. You know what I'm talking about? You would stab it into a can, and then you'd have to kind of manually ratchet it around the can, and it had a long point on it and a sharp blade. We're talking 1930s.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, kind of like a precursor of the military P-38.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
One of those came flying out of a drawer and past one of the reporters at head height and impaled itself in a wall in the
That'll
front
get your
parlor.
attention. Yeah.
That would definitely get mine.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, she's standing there or sitting there holding this first teacup and saucer, and it gets lifted out of Alma's hand in front of the reporters and floats on its own, and then it hits the ground and shatters. She's got at that time she has a second saucer in her hand, and that saucer rips out of her hands, hits the floor, spins around, and then shatters itself. All of it in front of the reporters. Now, they know that the husband, the kids, and the boarder are there. They were introduced to them, and they went out back to the garage. They saw them go. But how you could, even if you want to believe that they came back in the house, which I'm perfectly cool with, I don't see how any of those things could have occurred without them seeing something. I mean, particularly the saucers and stuff literally lifting and floating. So after the second saucer explodes, it had broken a piece off and impaled itself in her finger. And so they help her pull it out. They start bandaging her hand. And while they're sopping the hand with a clean napkin, there's this explosion in the kitchen. And they had gone through the house with her when they first came in. She introduced them and she went to the kitchen and get stuff. And that's when her family left, went to the garage to be out of the way. And when they got to the kitchen where this explosion had happened, there was a wine glass that had apparently, and this is how they wrote it, apparently escaped a locked cabinet and was shattered on the floor. Then out of nowhere, an egg whirled in through the living room door to crack against the wall. So it came flying out of the living room and smashed on the kitchen wall right by them. And a large chunk of coal out of the kitchen grate sailed across the room, passing within inches of the head of one of the reporters and smacked the wall. Thus began this adventure. It's quite a way to start the afternoon. Eventually, a paranormal investigator of the time, Nandor Fedor, who is famous in the realm. If you look him up, he's a little controversial. And that's because he had a fascination with Sigmund Freud. I'm not a Freud fan. And he thought that this was her psyche splintering and creating all this crazy energy. He didn't believe it was paranormal. He believed it was psychical in nature. And he also believed that her husband might be feeding this, in that he had PTSD from the war. He had fought in the war and he had come back. And during their time talking with this man, the husband admitted that he had horrible nightmares and he would wake up screaming at night. So there's a lot of stress in the home. And there wasn't a whole lot more known about it, except that Fedor took an interest in her until 2017. So because Fedor doesn't believe that everything that went on is psychical, he gets kind of lambasted by the psychic people. And because the psychology people want nothing to do with his harebrained theory of splintered psyches, they don't want anything to do with him. And then in some of his writing, he admits that she may have manufactured some of the events under stress to perform, but that the basic gist of everything is that she could do it. He ends up taking her to a scientific lab where he can get her to work under controlled conditions. She could make items materialize. Now, if you want to look up the story about what he did there, it was the International Institute of Kensington, where he and colleagues had her materialize a brooch from the thin air onto the table, then an ancient oil lamp, a white mouse, a living animal,
Ooh, okay.
a scarab beetle, a living thing, and a Japanese sparrow. She seemed to be, this is from his notes, she seemed to be able to project herself to Croydon, from Croydon to Kensington and back again, and to open herself to spirit possession. To assess her powers, I used all the modern methods at my disposal: voice recorders, telephones, cameras, X-ray, chemical analysis, hypnosis, and word association. He had her chronicle her dreams. He interviewed her. He tracked her movements. He laid traps for her. And he said if all of her phenomena were tricks, he wanted to know how she pulled them off. If not, he needed to understand the psychic mechanisms. Now, I'm going to tell you an interesting story. So they go, among the things he did was he would give her these tests that she couldn't know about ahead of time because he would not tell anybody. This is the most interesting one. At one point, he and a couple of his investigators take her to a Woolworths, which was a department store, kind of like the
Mhm.
Walmart of its day. And at the department store, they have her look at rings, and she finds that she's particularly fascinated with a ring with two beautiful stones over like the one span from one stone to the other stone. The span is covered with a piece of metal that looks like a little bridge. Okay.
Okay.
It's a very pretty little ring and it's very ornate. And so she really admires it, but she's not supposed to buy it. She's just supposed to look at it, pick the one she likes the most. And then when they leave the store, they she has a little box that she did buy something else while she was there. And as they're walking the down the sidewalk, they hear a thud in the box and she stops and she says, "Oh, what is that?" Now they are with her. They watch the clerk put the ring back in the glass case and lock it. And she had already had a purchase in a bag that one of them was carrying, and they had given it to her as they exited the store. They stop on the sidewalk. She pulls the little box out of the bag, opens it up, and inside, nestled in the piece of pottery she bought, is that ring. And he says, the clerk was very concerned about us and followed us about the store, wondering why one would look at all this jewelry and not purchase anything. Then he says, when they left, moving forward, as a group, we turned onto the road near the shop. Alma said that she heard a rattle in the box that she was carrying. And I took the box from her, opened it, and found the ring she had handled. My flesh creeped. Everyone was staggered. All swore they had seen the ring still in the jewelry store counter before we left. The experience was alarming. We had literally committed psychic shoplifting.
So did they prove that it was the ring? I mean, did they take it back and to say,
Well,
hey,
he
this was.
doesn't talk about that. I mean, he doesn't in the notes talk about that. But what does, I mean, they obviously went back when somebody went back in and looked, and there was still one in the case. Now, you can make the argument that, you know, they might have had more than one ring there and they replaced it, but they also had multiple observers with this group
Mhm.
who said they saw the clerk put that ring back in the slot, lock that ring back in the case, and they never left Alma out of their sight for her to go back and ask to look at it again or anything. They never left her alone.
Yeah, so that was my question though, or
Yeah.
the root of the question, was it the same ring or was it a duplicate?
Yeah.
And it
So
sounds
I
like it was a
can't give,
duplicate.
I don't know because, like I said, they're saying it was the original ring, that they saw it go back into that little slot and get locked back in that glass case that the rings were in. Then they all walked away together. And she would have had to have, if she had palmed it at that point, then they'd, however the ring have come from that she handed back to them to put in. And again, this was an unscheduled test. It wasn't like they said, "Hey, we're going to Woolworths." They just said, "Meet us at the facility." And then they're like, "Well, let's take a little walk. We'll see what happens." And they start talking to her as they're moving along as a group. So she didn't have any foreknowledge to plan to maybe get an extra ring or something like that, at least if his notes are accurate. So as I said, there were people who came around and said that she was, she was faking things, that this and that was going on. However, Fedor absolutely stuck by the fact that he did not believe that overall she was a fake. He said that he guessed that sometimes she could have faked phenomena in order to retain their interest, but if so, he would forgive such lapses because he had seen her do things that he knew to be genuine that he could not find a way to explain. Now, I will tell you, because I've been now in a very small way in that world, that people are very demanding. And I know of people who are sensitive, and they really are sensitive, who have been in situations where they're being belittled because they can't give an answer. And there is a temptation, although the people I know didn't do it, but there would be a temptation to just give them something and shut them up. The downside of that is if you're wrong, you've just lost your credibility forever. So if I can't provide something, I just can't provide something. It's just that simple. Eventually, she would draw the interest of Charles Fort, as in Fortean phenomena, and he would write that poltergeists emanate from those with no direct power, women, servants, adolescents, and children. Rarely does a male ever exhibit poltergeist activity. And he kind of backs up all of this. Now, because Fedor won't say that it's ghostly or paranormal, and he has some disagreements with the main community about these events, he says that he believes that they are supernatural events only because they are embodied by the splintering and contradiction of a traumatic experience. A ghost conjured the uneasy sense that something both was and was not real, that this event occurred as if it were outside of time. And his colleagues were appalled to learn of his conclusions about the haunting. And in 1938, the end of 1938, he presented a paper at the International Institution, and they confiscated all of his documents. They removed him from the institution, and to the best of everybody's ability to tell, all of his paperwork was destroyed, and they labeled Alma either insane or a fraud because he wasn't following whatever the status quo was. However, here's this really cool thing. So all those documents would eventually get sent, like whatever was left of his stuff would eventually get wrapped up into the International Institute of Psychical Research archives, which were supposedly destroyed during the end of World War II by German bombs. However, they weren't. Many of his files that were salvaged, which nobody knew they were his files because he misrepresented them in his writing so that they would not be destroyed if anything happened to him. Interestingly enough, that's a kind of weird thing. But I mean, it was the time frame. I could see a little bit of paranoia going in there. Anyway, these files don't get blown up. They're saved out of the wreckage and packed up, end up in the United States. And in 2017, this lady who's writing on the paranormal goes there and comes across a bunch of these files from England from that time period. And amongst them, she finds one called Mr. Fielding's file, a big, thick, fat file. Turns out to be Alma's file. And from that, she actually would end up writing a book. And the story gets a lot more documentation of what he saw, what he did, what he was thinking, because all the stuff that was gone, all that was left for the longest time was his critics' critique of what he said. And they called him a fraud and this. He would continue on in the field, by the way, for many years, and would eventually garner some fame and some accolades. Still had a lot of detractors because he was heavily into the psychical part. Now, I'm going to end it here for this week, and there are some more stories to share at a future date on this, including one of a poltergeist that possibly murdered an 11-year-old girl. But I want to, before I end this, I want to say one thing about Fedor. I'm not his biggest fan. I'm not his biggest skeptic. I'm open-minded on this gentleman. I've known about him for many years. I've read things he's written. One of the things that I find really, really interesting is that the MK Ultra files from the CIA, there's 125 programs that were contained under that moniker, the MK Ultra. Okay? Multiple of those programs were dedicated to using trauma and other techniques to split the psyche of an individual so that they could control the person's psyche and cause them to become a Manchurian candidate. There are people who testified in the 1970s in front of the Church Commission who were children who were literally purchased by the CIA and tortured so that they could cause trauma because they believed that the PTSD or the trauma would make these people's psyche split and then they could control what was left. So that concept of trauma creating a splintered psyche is now embedded in the field of psychology in lots of areas. It's not universally accepted, but it is a part of the psychological community's writings and documentation. And it was popular enough for the CIA to give it a shot, which means they literally tortured people in order to break their psyche and damage them enough that they could maybe rebuild them and control them. So even though I can't tell you what happened, I think it's a fascinating story, and I think it's even more fascinating when you know that scientists in the government, although they were shooting all this stuff down, were also taking note of it and then turning it around to try to use it for their own ends. And with that, I'm going to say good night.
I'll say good night, but then I'll have you say it again so you can have the last word.
Okay. So good night.